Hey, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Qasim, and today I want to go over all of Apple's newly announced products. Before I begin, check in the description down below so you can jump to your desired section of the video. Now, first and foremost, let's talk about the design of the iPhone 13 and 13 mini. It's exactly as it was rumored to be. It's the same as last year, except you've got rearranged diagonal cameras on the rear side. At the front of the iPhone, you've also got a smaller notch like I was expecting. That comes still with Face ID for authentication. You've got 5 colors to choose from. You've got a pink, you've got a blue, you've got a starlight, a midnight, which is like black, and then of course the product red. Now the design might be the same as last year's except for those 2 rear cameras, but internally the iPhone 13 and 13 mini have both changed. For the processor, you now have the A15, which is going to have up to 50% faster performance. Now, one thing to keep in mind with the A15 is that the GPU of the A15 in the 13 and 13 mini is only a 4-core GPU, not 5 cores like you get in the 13 Pro and 13 Pro Max. You've also got improved battery life. You've got bigger batteries in both the 13 and 13 mini. Now, if you're familiar with my channel, you know I am pretty happy about the 13 mini and the increased battery life simply because I love that little phone. It's an awesome phone and I have used it on a daily basis. So Apple is stating that we'll be able to get an hour and a half more of daily use out of the 13 mini, and for the 13 we'll get 2.5 hours more. Now on the front side, you've got the same Super Retina XDR display in both the iPhone 13 and 13 mini. What's changed here is the max brightness. We've gone from a previous 625 nits of max brightness to 800 nits max. Now, when watching HDR content, you still have a max of 1200 nits like you did on last year's iPhone 12 and 12 mini. Now the cameras on the rear of both the iPhone 13 and 13 mini have not only been rearranged, but they've also been improved. The wide camera has a larger sensor, which is going to allow in a lot more light. So it's going to improve those night mode shots. It's going to improve your overall detail and give you less distortion in your photos and videos. Now, a really exciting thing that's actually come to the wide camera of the 13 and 13 mini is the sensor shift stabilization. We saw this in the 12 Pro Max last year, and it's nice to see that feature come across all the iPhone 13 lineup. This is going to give us more improved optical image stabilization. I, for one, am personally excited about this because I shoot with both my iPhone 12 mini and 12 Pro. So having sensor shift stabilization in both my phones is going to be a huge plus. Now the sensor on the ultra wide camera has also been improved for both the iPhone 13 and 13 mini. This again is going to allow in more light than before, and it's going to give you more detail and less distortion when it comes to taking photos and videos with the ultra wide camera. A video mode that I'm really excited about is cinematic mode. Now this is going to be available across the board on all the iPhone 13 models. What cinematic mode is going to do is use something called rack focus. You've seen this in your favorite shows and movies. For example, if I'm sitting here and I'm looking into the camera and somebody walks into the background, the focus will shift between me as a subject to them as a subject. This is used to take your attention from one subject to another. Now I know a lot of people might be like, what is this? And we don't really need this. But being somebody who's done a bunch of creative videos with my iPhone, I solely shoot with my 12 mini and 12 Pro. You're watching from my 12 Pro right now. I will link down below a bunch of videos that I've done on this channel if you want to check them out. But for me personally, this is really exciting to have this kind of capability and to be able to even control the focus and alternate it afterwards. It's pretty awesome. Now next I want to talk about Photographic Styles. This is a pretty cool photo feature, and if you're somebody that loves taking photos, especially with all those filters, you're going to really love this. You've done it before. You've taken a picture and then applied a filter, and sometimes it just changes things like your skin tone. Well, photographic styles are basically filters with more control, and they're not going to affect things like your skin tone. And you have more control of dialing things like the tone and the warmth of the image. So you can choose from 4 preset styles, and you'll be able to fine tune them and set it as a specific style so that you can shoot photos in your style. We all tend to have a preference when it comes to taking photos and how they should look. So photographic styles is a nice nifty little feature that's going to be available on, again, all the iPhone 13 models. And I'm personally excited to check this out in person. Now, last but not least, let's talk about the prices of both the iPhone 13 and the 13 mini. Now, for the iPhone 13 mini, it's going to start at $699, and the iPhone 13 is going to start at $799. These are the same prices as last year, but you have to keep in mind what's been bumped up is the baseline storage. So instead of that 64 gigabytes, you're now going to be starting at 128 gigabytes, and you're going to be able to have a max option for 512 gigabytes in both the iPhone 13 and 13 mini. Now for the iPhone 13 mini, you're going to be paying $699 for the 128 gigabyte model, $799 for the 256 gigabyte model, and $999 for the max of 512 gigabytes. Now for the iPhone 13, you're going to be paying $799 for the 128 gigabyte model, $899 for the 256 gigabyte model, and $1099 for the max capacity of 512 gigabytes. Now, one thing to keep in mind when taking into account the prices for both the 13 and 13 mini is that if you're not selecting a carrier option, you're going to need to pay $30 more per each gigabyte model. So instead of $699, it's going to be $729 and so on. Now let's move on to the 13 Pro and 13 Pro Max. Now here too, the design is pretty much the same as last year. The only thing that's changed is the notch on the front has gotten smaller and the cameras in the rear are bigger due to the improvements that they have. In terms of colors, you've got the same graphite, silver, gold, and now instead of the Pacific blue, you've got a Sierra blue. Honestly, personally, I don't really care for the Sierra blue all that much. I like the Pacific blue, but I would have liked to see a different color. We saw a bunch of rumors on colors. Obviously, they weren't true here. But hey, if you like blue and a baby blue kind of color, this is going to be great for you. Now, although that the design is same, a few things internally have changed. You've got the A15, but do keep in mind you have a 5-core GPU in both the 13 Pro and the 13 Pro Max. And also another thing that's nice is that the camera systems on both the 13 Pro and Pro Max are the same this year. You know, up until this point, you always had to go to the Pro Max model to have the best in terms of the camera. But this year, if you want a smaller size like the 13 Pro, but you want the same camera capabilities, well, you'll finally have that option. Now, the battery has improved in both the 13 Pro and Pro Max. Apple is stating that you'll get an hour and a half of additional daily use on the 13 Pro. And for the 13 Pro Max, you'll get an additional 2.5 hours of daily use. On both the iPhone 13 Pro and 13 Pro Max, you've got an improved triple camera system. First and foremost, you've got a new telephoto camera with a 77mm focal length and 3x optical zoom. You've also got a new ultra-wide camera with an increased aperture and autofocus. This autofocus feature and increased aperture is going to improve the low light performance and also help in macro photography, which we'll talk about in a minute. Last but not least, you've got the wide camera, which now has a bigger sensor and an increased aperture. All these improvements in the camera system are going to allow in more detail no matter which lens you're shooting with. It's going to allow in more light and help you capture more detail in low light situations and improve both your photos and videos. And also don't forget, the camera system does have sensor shift stabilization like we saw in the previous generation. These improvements of the camera system are going to allow for a new feature Apple's calling macrophotography. Now for macro shots, typically you have a camera, you have a macro lens on it, and you can get some really cool looking detail shots, really close-up shots of plants and objects. But using computational photography and the improvements of the camera system, we're going to be able to do that with both the 13 Pro and 13 Pro Max. Now, just like the iPhone 13 and 13 mini, you've got cinematic mode here in the 13 Pro and Pro Max. You've also got the photographic styles, so you'll be able to tweak those custom filters and make photos a little bit more personal. Last but not least, you've got ProRes video for both the iPhone 13 Pro and Pro Max, but this isn't coming out till later in the fall. But ProRes video is what ProRAW is for photos. So when you take a ProRAW photo, you're able to retain a lot more detail in the photo, and you have more control when you go to edit it afterwards. ProRes video is the exact same thing, but for video. You'll have the ability to record in 4K in up to 30 frames per second in ProRes video. And once again, I personally am excited to give this a test run once it's finally available. Now let's move on to the display of the 13 Pro and 13 Pro Max. Now here you've got a smaller notch, but what's been due for a long time is a ProMotion display, a higher refresh rate display, and that's finally made its way to both the iPhone 13 Pro and Pro Max. Now what's cool is that with ProMotion, the iPhone is able to determine when you need a higher refresh rate and when it can slow things down, so it can preserve the battery life. Also, the software is going to be tracking how fast your fingers move across the screen to determine when it should speed things up or when it should slow them down. This is something we've seen on the iPad Pro, and this is what helps to give you a smooth and fluid experience when you need it and preserve battery life when you don't. Now the display brightness is also up from 800 nits to 1000 nits max on both the 13 Pro and 13 Pro Max. Now do keep in mind this is just in standard mode, so when you're watching HDR content, it's still going to be a max of 1200 nits like we saw on the 12 Pro and Pro Max. Last but not least, let's talk about the price of the 13 Pro and 13 Pro Max. Now the 13 Pro starts at $999 and the 13 Pro Max starts at $1099. You've also got a max storage option of 1 terabyte. The 13 Pro price for the 128 gigabyte model is $999. For the 256 gigabyte model, it's $1099. For the 512 gigabyte model, it's $1299. And for the 1 terabyte model, it's $1499. For the iPhone 13 Pro Max, the price for the 128 gigabyte model is $1099. For the 256 gigabyte model, it's $1199. For the 512 gigabyte model, it's $1399. And for the 1 terabyte model, it's $1599. Alright, so that is everything you need to know about all the iPhone 13 models, from the mini to the Max. They're going to be available for pre-order this Friday, September 17th. And from next Friday, they'll start getting delivered to those that pre-ordered. They'll be available in store and also online. Now, I personally am excited to get my hands on these and finally give you a review as to what I really think about each different model. In today's event, we also got an update to the iPad 8 from last year with an iPad 9th generation. It's very much so the same, but you've got a few things like the A13 chip. You've got 64 gigabytes of storage starting instead of the 32. You've got the same $329 starting price point, which is really nice. It's honestly a great amount of iPad to buy at that price. Now we've also got a 12 megapixel camera in the front and in the rear. What's cool is that you get center stage in the front, which we saw on the iPad Pros. So if you move around while you're on a FaceTime call, Zoom call, etc., the camera is going to follow you, which is a nice addition to a baseline iPad. When it comes to the iPads, there was also the announcement of an iPad mini refresh. Now this was much more like an iPad mini Air, simply because the design elements are like the iPad Air. You've got Touch ID in the lock button. You've got the same squared off design as the iPad Air. You've got the camera bump in the rear. This, speaking of the cameras, has the same 12 megapixel camera in the rear and in the front. You also get center stage. You've got an A15 Bionic chip inside powering this little baby iPad. And you've got Apple Pencil 2nd generation support. I honestly think that now more than ever, the iPad mini is looking like a pretty cool little iPad. If you're somebody that likes a smaller iPad, then this might be the right one for you. Now we also got an Apple Watch Series 7. I personally don't get caught up in leaks and rumors, but to be honest, I was hoping for a squared off design for the Apple Watch. I have a Series 4, I've had it since day one, and to be honest, the upgrades on the Series 7 aren't that significant for me. You've got a larger display, which is going to give you the ability to have an on-screen keyboard. I don't type much at all on my Apple Watch, so that isn't really significant for me. Also, the top glass is going to be tougher. Again, the Series 4 is a pretty durable watch. I've had it since day one on my wrist. I've bumped into walls and so many things, and I've got a few scratches, but I've never cracked the display on my Apple Watch. You've now also got a USB-C charger and fast charging to the point where you'll be able to charge up your Apple Watch to full in just 45 minutes. With the upcoming software update for watchOS 8, you're going to be able to get things like fall detection for cyclers. So if you're riding a bicycle and you fall over, it's going to be able to detect that. You'll also get auto start and stop functionality for cycling workouts and better e-bike support. If you have a Fitness Plus subscription, you'll also have the ability to do group workouts with up to 32 friends. The Apple Watch will be available later this fall. We don't have a date yet, so we just got to wait and see when it actually comes out. Alright, so that is everything Apple has just announced. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, comment down below with anything that you'd like to say, and most importantly, take care of yourself, and I will see you in the next video.